Thank you very much, both of you, for accepting the invitation to chair this session. I would like to thank the organizing committee. I would like to thank Kemal Hoca.
I cannot follow this in Turkish because the organizing committee just asked me to deliver the speech in Turkish, but the slides are in English. All right, so what I will do actually, I will switch between English and Turkish in some of the data, when I just present data. I think it's easy to understand, but because the slides are in English. But if necessary, you can raise your hand and then I can just, also switch to English. Başlığı biraz değiştirdim.
I have slightly modified the title of my lecture because we are working in a very complicated field. And we have to be more careful in evaluating the results. I have no conflicts of interest whatsoever with the pharmaceutical companies. I'm going to organize my lecture under 3 headings. One is phenome or phenotype as the first complexity. Well, I think it would be better if Kürşat presented because he likes talking more. I like writing more. So if you would like to read, here is an article for you which is about the slow death of the concept of schizophrenia and the painful birth of psychosis spectrum. The second complexity is exposome. This is not a very familiar term. Exposome is quite similar to genome. It's a totality of all environmental factors. It's a field that looks into this totality. It's a derivation of exposure, and with the Greek suffix "om." Well, I would like to talk about 2 studies. The first of which is this, which was published this year. The other one is this one. One is more data-based, the other one is more like a composition. And the third complexity is genome, which is all genes. I'm going to share this study for the first time with you, and it's been approved by the Journal of Psychiatry, and this is a study that for the first time studies at the molecular level the relationship between genetics and exposure. So, this is our study design, 3 categories: schizophrenia, bipolar, depression and anxiety. And mostly schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, which we believe has roots in genes, and depression and anxiety, which we believe is rooted in environment. Well, this is at least how we believed in the past, but for now we know that environmental factors are also important in schizophrenia, and likewise we know that genetic factors are important in depression and anxiety as well. But as we know, also in the clinic and in research, the diagnostic categories, they are really overlapping. just as you can see on the slides, they are not really clearly separated from one another in the nature. These are fuzzy sets, as you can see. These categories we assess with a dimensional approach, but in reality these categories, they don't really and clearly exist. And from a dimensional point of view, this is how the categories would look. See, depressive, mania, negative. For example, if mania is emphasized for one patient, mania and depression, so maybe if we had to put it in one category, that would fit in bipolar, positive and depressive, it would be schizophrenia. But as you can see, all the different dimensions, they're also present in the other categories as well. Well, we are very well aware of the genetic complexity now. The graph you see on the left is quite a popular one. This is from the Genomic Consortium genome mice sequence. There are so many genes which are interacting with one another, and now we are going away from candidate gene studies to genome-wide studies. So if you do candidate gene study, you would not easily get published anywhere. As I said, there are so many genetic factors to be taken into account. This is the Schizophrenia Consortium data. And moreover, genetic factors, or to be more precise, the single nucleotide polymorphism, the small genetic variants, as they are called, are overlapping with one another in many psychiatric disorders. So every year we see at least one or two publications in prominent journals about genetic overlap between schizophrenia and other disorders. When we evaluate exposome, up until now, the only environmental factor, it was assessed as one environmental factor and one psychiatric disorder. There was not a more holistic study. So these are the environmental factors like obsessive compulsions, childhood traumas, urban environment, cannabis use, social defeat, which are the environmental factors associated with this disorder. Social defeat is related to migration or being the member of an ethnic minority, but they have always been studied separately or alone. But we all know that there is an interaction between genes and the environment. The diagnostic criteria are intertwined, and many genes and many environmental factors come together to surpass a level which is called the liability threshold and give rise to a clinical syndrome. It's not very clear, but do you know him? Do you know this person? This is Timuçin Oral. I'm grateful to him because while I was a resident, he helped me a lot, both during research and in the clinic. Why? Because you can't see his face clearly, but he's a fan of Douglas Adams, and on his t-shirt there is a design from the book Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So my point here is genetic factors we have always studied in an isolated fashion, but genetic and environmental factors are quite related to one another, and they interact significantly with one another. So using this data set, or namely the Nemesis data set, the Netherlands Mental Health Survey and Incidence Study, we did an assessment they did an assessment at 3 different points in time, covering 6,646 people. We first checked the baseline data. It's a rather simple analysis, and I know statistics is not our favorite subject, nor was it mine, but let me try and explain this way. We chose 4 mental health outcomes: mania, depression, anxiety, and psychosis. We chose also 3 demographic factors, being age, female, gender, and education. And we chose 7 environmental factors which have previously been associated with psychosis: tobacco use, urbanicity during childhood trauma, ethnic minority, hearing impairment, cannabis use, and winter birth. Well, these are some of the environmental factors that have been used in other works before. We did a correlation analysis in order to see how these factors were correlated with one another in the baseline data. For example, cannabis use is related to the 4 mental health outcomes, all of them: psychosis, anxiety, depression, and mania. But also it is related to the demographic factors. All of those are statistically significant. So these are correlations that are smaller than 0.05. Well, the thickness of the line shows the significance level, and the color of the line represent negative relation or positive relation, red being negative, green being positive. So there is a relationship with age, gender, and education, and this is not very unusual. So it tells us that young people use more cannabis, and males use more cannabis, yes, and so those with a certain educational background use more cannabis. So also cannabis use and tobacco use are quite closely correlated. Also, use of cannabis is also related to having spent childhood in a city and also having had a childhood trauma. This is specifically for childhood trauma. You can see the correlations. Trauma is related to all the 4 different disorders, also related to gender and tobacco use, urbanicity, hearing impairment, also cannabis use. What about the urban environment correlation? This here is yet another similar correlation outlook. And now I'm going to show you the final one. So we are talking about a complex network of relationships between all these different factors. So when we focus on one of them, we tend to ignore the relationships between the other ones. For example, the relationship between psychosis and cannabis use. What is the actual dimension or size of it when we take into account all the other factors? Or what are the relationships of other environmental factors with psychosis? We are not doing this, at least so far we have not done it, and we have focused on genes or one environmental factor only. So this part may be a little complicated, but I will explain what we have done in our study. So we are interested in psychosis. We chose psychosis as an outcome using logistic regression. This is our outcome. We evaluated cannabis use as our independent variable. At the same time, we added family load as well. So this is a very simple analysis. All the combinations, cannabis use and psychosis. This is the first model, and the other ones are other models. So H, again, psychosis is an outcome. Winter birth is the third model. Age and gender is the fourth model. So continuing like this, we have reached a total of 1024 models. Taking out the odds ratios from these 1024 models, and we also found the range of p-values, following which we checked the relative odds ratio, the ratio of first percentile odds ratios to 99 percentile odds ratios, and the range of p-value therefore is negative log 10 p-value first percentile plus etc. And this is a chart showing the results. So these points each are odds ratios obtained from all the different models. What's significant here is that whatever you do or however you model it, cannabis use is related to psychosis. But as you can see, when you increase the independent variable, in other words, when you control the other factors, the odds ratio tends to decrease. 2.23 odds ratio is the amount of change here between the model with only cannabis and the model with everything. So there is a very stable decrease. So whatever the case, cannabis use is correlated with psychosis, and I'm talking about correlation and emphasizing it. Why? Because causality is an entire different story. In order to be able to say cannabis causes psychosis, you need to do other studies. So why did we choose cannabis? Because cannabis is a more widely known environmental factor. What happens if we choose another factor like hearing impairment? Hearing impairment has also been associated with psychosis in other studies. But when you check these correlations, only 35% is statistically significant. Only 35% of those factors are statistically significant. The others are not statistically significant. As you can see, the nominal statistical significance here. And this shows us that compared to cannabis use, hearing impairment is a weaker environmental factor. So what we need to be careful about in all the studies is that there are many factors changing significance or the odd ratios in all those models. So it depends on which factors you include in the model. Model specification, study population. Let's say you do it in Turkey, you will get a different rate of cannabis use as compared to that you have in UK. Also, exposure definition is important, because when we talk about cannabis use, is it single use, is it using every week, using every day? So when everybody evaluates this differently, of course you are going to have a different result. Also, mental health outcome assessment is important. And I would like to proceed with another topic. I'm going to talk about the exposome-genome relationship. Fisher is a better known figure, and maybe you know him from the Fisher test. He has a lot of contributions to statistics, and Lancelot Hogben is the one who first proposed statistical exposome-genome interaction, and he has had a lot of disagreements with Fisher, but Fisher was more popular at the time, and he was also receiving the title of Sir, and therefore we all forgot about Lancelot Hogben. And maybe it's because he was a political activist himself. Well, this study is important because Turkey is included in this study. It's EUGI study. It's also a group study. The sample is Turkey, Italy, Serbia, and the Netherlands. So we have siblings, controls, and schizophrenia diagnosed patients. But in this study of ours, we evaluated just the patients and the controls, checking what was the level of interaction between exposome and genome. And following the same principle, we assessed all the environmental factors in this study. As you can see, all of the environmental factors, other than winter birth, seem to be correlated with schizophrenia with different odd ratios, but they're all related to schizophrenia. For us, cannabis use was weekly use, once or more in a week. So these are all yes/no values. I think you remember this one. Many genes. And they all have different statistical odds ratios. So instead of assessing just one gene, we calculated this thing we call polygenic score. That's easy actually, theoretically speaking. It can be used for diseases other than schizophrenia as well. you can use the odds ratios you get from the GWAS to calculate the polygenic score or the risk of one person developing schizophrenia. So, as you can see here, each one of those have a log-odds ratio and also a p-value. This is a training data set, or GWAS. The log-odds ratios coming from there, you can calculate in your own data depending on a certain p-value. This is how you do it. And these are our patients, these are our controls. Let's say one patient, one control. So 0.06 increase in risk. So we add them up with one another. So there are two here. 0.14 A. Again, you add them, and you get a final score for each one. You can do it with certain p-values. This one was done without choosing a p-value, but if we had chosen a certain p-value, let's say 0.03, then we would have to add this allele, but we wouldn't add it in the other one. So in our data set, we calculated the polygenic risk scores as well, and it turns out that the polygenic risk scores are indeed correlated with the disease. And then we chose a cutoff over 75 percentile. As I told you, there was a liability threshold beyond which point the risk of the disease would increase, and this is how we evaluate it, because we want to check the gene environment relationship. We also proved it to be correlated with the disease. Of course, when you use a cutting point, the odds ratio tends to be higher. This is very simple. Looking at the additive exposome genome relationship, when you look at it this way, you see that if A plus B is smaller than C, then you can propose that there is a relationship between the exposome and the genome. As you can see, cannabis use and molecular genetic disposition is correlated, in additively speaking. So emotional neglect, also bullying and PRS, and these are also correlated, and for the other ones we could not find any interaction. Well, because of my obsession, I chose different cutoff levels as well. I imputed the data. I also used another method, and in all of those methods we have found the same result. Well, the editors and peers, they don't like my obsession, but I really defend the idea that we should be proving what we are proposing, and so it's a cutoff level I have chosen myself. So well, can we do this genetic score, the polygenic risk score, in the same way but as exposome score? And I'm sharing it with you For the first time, I have never shared it before. I was in the Netherlands before, and this is a very new result. And it will be published soon as well. These are the genetic factors. As you remember, we add them up to get a polygenic risk score. But we know how related the environmental factors are with one another, because if you add them up one by one, you would have overestimated the score. So we need to find another method. So since we don't have many environmental factors here, we can follow a different method to do that. This is what we did. We had two datas, as you know, the EU, GEI, Turkey, Serbia, Spain, and there is also the group data, including only the Netherlands. So we used the data at the bottom as training and the one at the top as a test. We did the modeling here and we tested the results here. Again, we did like case control and we checked it here. Our advantage was it included siblings as well, because when we find a score, we expect it to be highest in patients, also then in the siblings, maybe slightly lower than the patients, and we expect the lowest scores to be in the controls. We used some different models. This part may look a little bit complicated, but so we have an odds ratio different for each model. So since we are evaluating all of them at the same time in the same model, we are also evaluating their relationship with one another. I'm not going to go into the details. More or less all the models have produced similar results, but this model here was modeled based on the assumption that all environmental factors or models are different from one another. So the scores for this model is worse, and you get the worst result here, because as I explained in the beginning, your sample data or what kind of environmental factors you are including in your data set is important for the outcome. And here we use the results coming from logistic regression method, because logistic regression is quite common and you can do it in almost any statistics software. And as this data suggests, the highest score is found in patients, and then in siblings, and then in the controls. Also, with the exposome score, the odds ratio also increases, the relationship increases, and the correlation increases, sorry. And when you use a cutting point, you get 10.23 odds ratio, which is going down afterwards.
Bağlayarak anlatıyorum ama farklı çalışmalar ama bir.
This is something new, but they are all related to one another. This is the interaction with the environment. It's very interesting, by the way. One of my PhD students recent studies, and it was also submitted in Orlando. As clinicians, we always look at the symptoms from certain periods, let's say from certain sections. Patient comes and after a month, patient comes again. However, on a daily life basis, certain mood disorders or certain mood fluctuations do happen. So how can we change, how can we evaluate it? Here you can see There must be a picture, however, it is not there. There is a science map application, right? It is also valid in Turkish. If you have iPhone, or it could also be Android, you can download it. It's called PsyMake. So it uses ESM method, and it continuously sends notifications to you, let's say 10 times a day. It is totally randomly and asks about how do you feel. Ecologically, it is a more valid method, and it is also free from retrospective bias, and you can ask different questions based on your study design. There are 10 notifications beeps, as I've mentioned. It doesn't have to be patients all the time, but the most important thing is that it is evaluated randomly. There is no time interval or a specific period. It is much closer to normal life. And likewise, you can see childhood period trauma. We know that childhood trauma and daily stress is very much interacted with one another, and it is also affecting psychotic experiences and emotional expression. As I've stated before, and there are certain candidate genes trials. They have already been finalized. There is the effect of candidate genes and daily mood, and it also affects stress, emotional expression, and psychotic changes. In our study, we used our previous method and evaluated childhood trauma. This is a very interesting population. It is comprised of twins from Belgium, and it is still being collected, by the way. Many samples are being collected, and we are making our assessments. We have evaluated PRS, as I've already mentioned, and also childhood adversity, childhood trauma has been assessed. Rather than evaluating them one by one, it has been taken as a score, single score. Childhood trauma score was used, and it has equivalence in Turkish. And this application always asks you a question: are you stressed? Is it a stressed environment? So who are you with? It depends on the event, it depends on the social life aspect. So we have evaluated the stress which are dependent on for these factors. And here you can see negative effects, positive effects, and psychotic experiences have been evaluated as the mental state. By the way, psychotic experiences are not psychotic syndromes or symptoms. So from psychosis to psychotic experiences, from clinic to daily life, it changes. These are not syndromes. For instance, I feel paranoid right now. You might feel paranoid at this time, or Kürşat might be talking about me behind me, for instance. There could be a lot of items like that, and we have collected all those items one by one and combined them in 3 domains. After that, we have checked the PRS and gene and environment interaction, and PRS is positively affected and correlated with positive effect, and in the general population we see that yes, there is PRS for schizophrenia. Is it really related to disease? Yes, it is related to illness, but it might be related to other things. And to tell the truth, I want to do something about that as well, because it could be related to creativity or something else. It is very complex because it includes a lot of genes. And here you can see we have checked the interaction between these two. And childhood adversity, childhood trauma. has negative effect on negative, positive affect and psychotic experience. It increases negative affect, positive affect, and it also increases the number of psychotic experiences. But at the same time, there is a very significant interaction. It is just for you to understand more easily. There is two variables. These are not categoric, by the way. None of them is categoric. We have just prepared this so that you can understand it more easily. If you have molecular genetic tendency, if you are also exposed to childhood adversity or trauma, then it means that your psychotic life scoring is higher. And here you can see daily life stressors and molecular genetic disposition interaction, but there is no relation in between these two. So childhood adversity is much more effective on our daily life emotions, especially when it is triggered with molecular genetic disposition. This is the last conclusion. As you can see, it is not only psychotic experiences, but also negative and positive effects, and all the psychological dimensions have been affected by childhood adversity or childhood trauma. And at the very end, I will be talking about this because we can evaluate a lot of different methods, techniques, and this is something that I really liked writing about. And then we did it on an original basis as a research. So we are always talking about symptoms like paranoia, hallucinations, hostility, schizophrenia, measures paranoia, hallucinations, hostility, etc. We are always evaluating these feelings from the schizophrenia category or bipolar category, but we can also look at it from a network perspective. For instance, hallucinations and paranoia, the relation between these two might be valid. So one might hear sounds. Actually, we see this kind of examples in the clinic. So hearing those kind of sounds might be increasing that person's paranoid delusions, because it could be related to hearing a sound. And other symptoms could also be very much related to the others. For instance, external fields, disposition on hallucination. It could be triggered by genetic effects between hallucination and aggression. That relation could be triggered by both external and internal fields. It's a bit complicated and complex analysis. I'm not going to be dwelling on the details of the analysis. However, one thing that I want to show you, there are many symptoms here, and those symptoms have relations. And this is something that we expect. Polygenic risk score has relations with certain specific things here. You can see them among those items. You can see paranoid delusions and hallucinations. These are very much correlated and related to positive findings, and it then moves on with some other network items. This is something very complicated. We are always trying to simplify it. But in order to carry out very complex analysis, you have to gather too much data. And this is something that I have simplified already. And they're all connected to one another. Yes, we are evaluating them by simplifying them, but I think we have to be more careful. Especially, we are at the area of research. And we should not be writing like we have found this, we have figured out this, rather than writing them in that manner. I think we have to be more humble. And this is the way that I want to conclude my speech. A lot of people have exerted their efforts. My PhD students and team Bart, you have also listened to Bart beforehand. And from Turkey, there is a very big group, EUGI. Thank you very much.